There's speculation that there may be tighter restrictions or a degree of a lockdown as COVID-19 figures continue to rise dramatically. Obviously, there have been 4 main hotspots that the president and the country have singled out, but these could have national implications. We're told President Cyril Ramaphosa held a meeting with various stakeholders and will address the nation tomorrow evening. Last week, Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize confirmed that South Africa is in the midst of a second wave of COVID-19. Concerns have been expressed over the impact to the economy, with further restrictions and potential impact of December celebrations and the abuse of alcohol in the country's health system. To discuss these factors and more, we're joined now by Ms. Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective, Mr. Cas Coovadia, Senior CEO of Business Unity South Africa, and Professor Somadoda Fikeni, Political Analyst. Very good evening to you all, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Let me start with you, Professor Fikeni. At this point, there's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Conundrum facing the president, but the issue is about the effectiveness of a lockdown. For it to be effective, just how far should he go?
Well, I do think that it will have to be a mobilization of government and all other social players and an appeal to people to exercise some caution, and even businesses to exercise some role instead of simply imposing, as was the case in level 5. And also law enforcement agencies may be out and about, and even possibilities of being assisted by the army. Those are some of the possibilities during the window period between Christmas and the New Year period. And of course, he may have to make some mention of where the vaccine distribution is, given the fact that the Drug Administration in the US and in Russia, they are already having the vaccine rolling out. So that balancing act of trying to restrict gatherings and also at the same time not shutting down the economy entirely, especially for those industries which have been hard hit, like tourism or hospitality industry. So that balancing act will be one of the most complex ones that they'll have to embark on.
Ms. Pheko, I'd like to look at the state of the economy. We spoke to Saftu earlier on, who during the week lambasted what it said was not only the accuracy or the fallacy of Stats SA's GDP figures. We know that that rose by 13.5%. The broader definition of unemployment is almost reaching 50%. So how do we take what could be two contrasting pictures to really get a sense of how far the president will have to stretch himself in managing this situation?
Well, interestingly enough, we're told by some business reporters that the local economy saw a bit of a rebound with GDP during the third quarter of 2020, which is not surprising, seeing as that there has been an acceleration of business activity, of corporate activity. There has been much more movement, much less restricted. Restaurants, the hospitality sector, the production and manufacturing sector, a lot of the restrictions which were present in the earlier lockdown phases around May, June, July, for example, where only a percentage of personnel could be in production sector or the retail sector at any given time. Those have been eased, of course. We saw that alcohol has gone up, the consumption well, not so much the consumption, but certainly the retail value. So the downside of that, of course, is that it also means that there's been a higher level of proximity, far more people moving in large groups and in great proximity. This could mean, however, that the growth on the economic side, I think the 13.5% growth is very positive. I mean, that's a good thing, because there has been at least four negative downturns. I would argue that, this thing that's called a technical recession, we have been in for quite a long time. It goes back to that toxic, very difficult balancing act between saving the economy as though the economy is a human being or saving people's lives. But I do also tend to think that there has to be somewhere a median between the two, where the levels of discipline, just self-discipline, the levels of, I think, public control have been relaxed quite a bit, quite considerably. When we look at where we were in March, April, where people, the roads were literally empty, that's probably possibly a place where we need to consider a medium ground to going back to. We also have to consider much better surveillance of public gatherings. I was at a funeral myself a couple of weeks ago. I can't call what I saw there social distancing, and there was certainly nobody there to even regulate that. People have been getting married, 300 people, 400 people, no masks, a scant presence of that. So we need to be much more balanced and nuanced in finding the middle ground.
And Mr. Coovadia, how would businesses then, in a practical way, deal with that? We're told that there's an expected contraction of 8% of the economy. So that goes with disposable income. And if we are moving into a period where businesses, including the hospitality industry and possibly the retail sector, could suffer more if there are greater restrictions during this festive season?
Well, look, I think firstly, let me just echo that the fact that the economy grew in the last quarter obviously is welcome news. But let's understand that we had a significant downturn in the previous quarter. We've had numerous downturns in the previous quarters. And as you say, we're expecting the economy to actually contract by 8% for the full year. And there's still plenty to do in the economy before we actually get to any sustainable growth. So, any response that actually puts further pressure on the economy, we believe would be, in the current circumstances, inappropriate. The economy just cannot take that. Having said that, we think that we do need to promote more, communicate more, enforce more, oversee and regulate properly, so that people do meet the health protocols. We also think that, particularly for people who stay in, and a lot of our people do stay in overcrowded areas, stay with families in fairly overcrowded residences, we think that those people who are working currently are probably better able to manage the health protocols at work than at home. We've got to ensure that businesses meet those health protocols. We're certainly communicating to our members that businesses must play their part in ensuring that health protocols are met, that sanitization happens, that masks are worn, that social distancing happens. And we've got to manage those, but we've got to regulate those properly. So things like, we now see that there's about 1,300, Gauteng has picked up 1,300 cases of contraction from the raves that were held in KwaZulu-Natal, and about 1,050 are positive. We shouldn't have had those raves. We can't have it's like those. Those are where clearly there are vectors for contraction and vectors for spreading. We've got to stop that. There shouldn't be any discussion about that.
It's interesting that you should say that, Mr. Coovadia, and I'm going to pass this next question on to you, Professor Fikeni. We've seen the official opposition almost waving a finger at the president, saying, should I use what's become now, a common phrase, don't you dare, with respect to, tightening the restrictions in areas that are, obviously seeing an increasing rise in cases. So do you think there's going to be a political fallout from what the president announces tomorrow? Because there are parties who believe that any further restrictions could completely sink the economy.
Well, I do think that a balancing act that leaves responsibility to businesses with stringent compliances, but at the same time, a stricter law enforcement might just strike that particular balance. At the same time, you must understand that parties like the DA do have the pro-market, position, in a sense that they would want to be seen to be doing everything for business, even though, of course, their articulation, they'll say it's for livelihood and the workers, which to some degree is true, because the unions also are calling for a situation where there is no complete shutdown. That in itself, I don't think there will be a political fallout to the extreme, because any rational person will realize that the world over, there is a dilemma here of saving livelihoods, at the same time saving lives, and striking a balance and being more strict in making sure that there is an enforcement of any restrictions imposed is important.
Ms. Pheko, let's come to the measures that had been put in place thus far to at least cushion the blow for many of those who've had job losses, for those who've been driven further into the poverty trap. It was interesting to look at the figures that 3 million of those job losses, 2 million of those, it's women who accounted for them. Has enough been done for that? Because you will hear, especially in the hospitality industry, people complaining that their businesses have not been able to, access some of those rescue packages. And others in the small, medium, micro enterprises have not benefited from the so-called stimulus package.
So that's an interesting question for several reasons. The one being, of course, that the hospitality sector was, I think some business reporters described what happened there in the last few months, the first few months of the lockdown, as a tsunami to that particular sector, and reported record losses, some of the highest losses of the last 100 years, in fact, in that particular sector. And also the second part that's interesting about that, and what many of us have known, is that like many things, in terms of employment retention and labor patterns, Black women have been the greatest ones who always seem to suffer the most, or who often are at the back end of all of this. So there's a gendered lens and a racialized lens to all of this, which we must always bear in mind. And thirdly, that even the people who have been able to access the grants. So remember that out of all of the new grants which were dispensed with, the 350 rand for the missing middle, so to speak, which has been quite difficult to access. It has a particular time period and horizon. So it's quite important for us to rethink what the social contract means. I think I've been saying this for like 6 months, but it would be useful to rethink what the social contract means, particularly because this is an unforeseen circumstance. So what is it going to take for the state to then begin to subsidize its citizens, its workers, and people who have found themselves in these unexpected straits? And I think that the other thing that's quite tricky is that even small businesses, which were supposed to access so-called informal traders, I prefer the word, parallel traders or first sector, which are not always documented, but certainly are not informal. And again, where Black women are highly saturated, not only people on street corners and street vendors and so on, but people who run small entrepreneurs, and sometimes not so small. There are huge barriers in even in accessing business relief for them. You have to have your SARS in order. You have to be registered with the CIPC. You have to be registered with the UIF. There have been these incredible hurdles which almost penalize small businesses and even larger businesses, small-scale entrepreneurs, for trying to get help. And I think there's this kind of penalizing, criminalizing element. One would have hoped that the state would put in place some sort of an amnesty, so that when people do present themselves, if they haven't been perhaps regular with their taxes in the past, if they haven't per se been regularized or documented or been as rigorous with their paperwork and with their invoicing, that this would be the opportunity to mentor them and to put some corrective measures in place and remediate them into a space where they're able to then access all of these opportunities. But again, as I've been saying for the last 6 months, this is really a symptom of struggle structural deficits with the way that our economy is already in place, right? And this trickle-down theory, and again, the crevices, the misexpenditure in the social economy, which should include health and education. These cleavages are clearly showing now, and the fact that a lot of women, Black women in particular, multitask, both in the marketplace and in the social reproductive spaces.
Mr. Coovadia, there has been a small to medium business loan scheme in conjunction with the banks. I want to talk about has that really helped, including the payment breaks that were given to consumers who qualified for it, but what about those who didn't? And that would include those who are in the small to medium sector. So if people are saying we're looking at the bigger picture, what is the bigger picture right now, and what kind of help can be given in anticipation of a possible further damage to the sector?
Well, look, I think, and I don't have latest data on how the Credit Guarantee Fund has done, but the Reserve Bank Treasury, working with the banks, have tried to ensure that those, there are criteria to be met, those that meet criteria and those that do apply have been helped in different ways, be it through restructuring of loans, be it through granting of additional credit, and other mechanisms. There was also the 500 million rand fund that the Department of Small Enterprise Development established. I'm not too sure how well that has gone. But the issue here that we also have to unfortunately face is that to a great extent we facing a perfect storm, because we also don't have the wherewithal in our economy, and we don't have the fiscal space to actually continue some of the emergency rescue packages that we had during the first wave. And so we're going to have to see how the public and private sector can work together. And we did during the first phase of COVID. Government, labor, community, and business worked very well together through a NEDLAC rapid response task team, a COVID rapid response task team. And we collaborated to see how we can, as the four critical stakeholders, actually begin to make the intervention that are necessary. I think that is necessary again. We need to see what sort of partnerships we can put together, but we also need to appreciate that the capacity of the state to actually put into place emergency packages like the 500 billion rand they put together during the first phase is pretty limited. And we've seen recently how the Solidarity Fund had to come to the fore to actually put up the money for the deposit we had to pay for the vaccines to COVAX. And that's because the state did not have the capacity to do so. So we do. I mean, the reality is that our economy is in severe straits, and some of the discussions that have been happening between social partners and particularly with government is what are the fundamental structural reform issues we need to actually begin to implement to get our economy onto a sustainable growth path.
So very briefly, Professor Fikeni, there are gaps which we're told that we should have been more aware of in the impact of COVID-19, though we couldn't have anticipated the scale of what we were dealing with because it's unprecedented. But if you look at the loss of socio-economic protections, for instance, people suffered because of unconventional rent collection measures, foreclosures on loans that drove people into even harder circumstances. There was the loss of public transport, which meant that people couldn't go to work. And obviously there's the issue of electricity becoming even more unaffordable as a result of all of this. So what can we do better?
Well, I do think that not every crisis ends up in a bad way. Most of the countries that have reset themselves into a better path have been through a crisis. What crisis does, it focuses our minds, as Lebohang has said, on the deep structural issues and contradictions that ought to be addressed, which we have not had the courage to address all along. So this is the opportunity to say, how do you create a people-centered, inclusive economy? How do you deal with many issues that we have always been avoiding all along? And this is the opportunity. It was during the Great Depression that America changed most of its social policies and some of its economic policies. It was post-Second World War II that you had many changes that were effected, which still govern the world today. And this is the opportunity to press a reset button for South Africa, for Africa and the world. And we can deal with the issue of the state-owned companies, for example, deal with the issues of efficiencies, but more important here, two critical variables: leadership in government, in the private sector and civil society, as well as a capable state which can deliver on some of these things. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much to all of you. Ms. Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Cas Coovadia, CEO, Business Unity of South Africa, and Professor Somadoda Fikeni, Political Analyst.